Was this video an excuse to drink wine while I film? Maybe. But if Hemingway can write drunk and edit sober, I can film drunk and edit drunker. Hi, my name is Adriana, and today I'll be giving you some nonfiction and fiction pairings, much like a glass of wine with dinner. So the idea for this video came to me while I was listening to my current audiobook read, and I kept thinking back to like this fiction book that I had read a while ago and how well these books actually would function together, and how I kind of wish I had read this nonfiction book before I jumped into the fiction book. But the nonfiction book just came out, and the fiction book came out a couple years ago. And of course, I have seen my friends Bailey and Martine from Is Bailey Reading and Just Martine respectively do this with their Magic Treehouse read-along. So they will read 3 books from the Magic Treehouse series and then read a nonfiction book to go along with one of the themes in one of the Magic Treehouse books. This is a tried and true technique to reading, it seems. Anyway, it got me thinking, like, are there any other nonfiction, fiction, literary pairings that go together surprisingly well and enhance the reading experience of what you are reading? So that's kind of what I've spent the past couple days kind of ruminating on, and I've come up with 5 nonfiction books, and some of the nonfiction books fit with multiple books. Some of them are a very specific pairing, but I think all of these nonfiction books will enhance your reading experience with other books. So before we jump into my pairings, please consider liking and commenting on this video and subscribing to my channel if you like bookish things. So let's get started with the first pairing that really spurred on this video for me. The nonfiction book for this pairing is A Map of Future Ruins. This is a fairly new release. It is by a journalist who has spent a lot of her career writing on the immigration issues into the EU via Greece and Turkey from kind of North Africa areas, and also comparing it to immigration issues we are experiencing and human rights violations that are happening in the American South, as well as on the Norwegian-Russian border, and just kind of all over the place. Seems like wherever there's a border, there's issues. So it's kind of like part memoir and then part like discussing political issues, because the author herself is of Greek descent. So she takes all of these trips to Greece over her life, trying to trace back her own lineage and her experience in Greece and what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to belong somewhere. And so far it's just been a very good book. And I think it pairs very well with What Strange Paradise, which is actually another book written by a journalist, but pretty much the same topic. It is a young, I believe he's even Syrian. Yep. A young Syrian refugee escaping Syria, going through Egypt, and landing on a Greek island in the Mediterranean. And he doesn't end up in a detention camp, fortunately, but that is through some friendships and relationships he makes with people on the island, even though he doesn't speak the same language and everything else. And it's just a very good book, and I wish I would have been able to read Map of Future Ruins first, just to get a better idea of how inhumane of conditions the main character of this book could have ended up in had things gone slightly different for him in the plot. That's pairing number 1. Pairing number 2 is one of those books I was talking about where it could kind of fit with multiple books, but that is What is Real by, let's put it on this side. What is Real by Adam Becker. He dives into quantum mechanics from the ground up, from the foundations of how it came to be, even touching on some of the anti-Semitism that really disrupted our progress when it comes to quantum mechanics. And yeah, it's a very good book. It might require that you have some background in higher-ish level chemistry or physics, but I think he does a pretty good job of, I mean, I'm pretty dumb, and I had a good time reading this. Because it does focus more on like the human side of how we came to discover quantum mechanics and how we came to interpret all of this crazy math that is quantum mechanics, with going a little bit into the crazy math and what it means. This, I think, is a good match for any book that uses the trope of folding a piece of paper in half and putting a pencil through it to describe a wormhole, because this will actually describe how wormholes work and what it means and electron tunneling and all of that good stuff. But in general, this might be less of a specific wine and more of a beer when it comes to pairing. Like, you could read this with almost any sci-fi book, and I think it's going to enhance your enjoyment because so much modern sci-fi is based on these quantum mechanic ideas because it's cool science. So I just kind of grabbed some random sci-fi-ish books that I have. Black Order in the Sigma Force, this is the third book? Yes, third book in the Sigma Force series, specifically does call out quantum mechanics. Obviously, quantum mechanics, it is a fairly new science. Really came to be in like the 1920s, but kind of had a big resurgence in the early 2000s with the building of the CERN Hadron Collider, particle collider. Man, I'm really like digging into the back of my STEM brain here. But around the time when this book was written, we cared a lot about quantum mechanics because we could smash particles together and find exciting things. Another good pairing for this, I would say, is the Space Between Worlds. This obviously relies very heavily on the, I mean, maybe not obvious. This book is about traveling to parallel universes, which parallel universes is a theory that comes from quantum mechanics. So I think these marry very well because can't have this without this. I think one that is also good is One Last Stop, because I don't know if this exactly uses the fold a piece of paper and stick a pencil through it wormhole thing, but there is like a wormhole thing. So, One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston, time travel-ish, rom-com-ish, genre mashing of everything, and super fun. And I wish more people would read it and give it a chance. And, you know, read it with this book. They'd be good together. But again, I think What Is Real could be read with pretty much any modern sci-fi book and would enhance your enjoyment and understanding of some of the more high sci-fi concepts. So the next nonfiction is a book I can't shut up about, and that is Starstruck by Serafina El Badri Nance. This is a memoir about a woman who grew up in the early 2000s as half Egyptian, and her struggles getting into a scientific field. She really wanted to be an astronaut, and later in life gets diagnosed with the BRCA2 gene, I think it's that one, which is the gene that is a marker for very highly increased chances of several different types of cancer, but most notably breast cancer. So she goes through, kind of documents her journey on getting a preventative double mastectomy. Anyway, extremely thought-provoking and important memoir in my opinion. She talks a lot about racism in the early 2000s after the 9/11 attack as a notably Middle Eastern looking woman, and this pairing might be a bit of a stretch, but I think there's enough connection that you can like make it work. And that is Gold Diggers by Sanjana Sathian. This book is about an Indian family who live in a suburb of Atlanta. I think she lives in a suburb of Houston or Dallas, somewhere in Texas. These guys are in Georgia. It's kind of that early 2000s Bush era, post 9/11 era. They also get hit with some racism, Islamophobia based racism, and one of the characters ends up in STEM. But I think we don't quite dive super deep into the experience of, I guess I'm having a hard time explaining this because like big themes of this book are being a second generation American and dealing with overly ambitious parents and all of that. But we also have kind of this like magical realism thing going on with some kind of like light fantasy stuff. And while I think this book does do a pretty good job, I just think like I just connect so much more to like Serafina's real story and real experience of figuring out how to be a first generation American dealing with immigrant parents. I don't know. I think they complement each other well, because while I think this book is fairly strong in some of those themes, I think it could be made stronger by bringing the two books together. And I also love both of these books, so this is just an excuse for you to read them both. This next one, I'm going to try to not let myself rant. So like I was raving about these books. This one, there's gonna be a rant coming and I'm gonna do my best to get around it, but we'll see. I'm going to start with the nonfiction book, and this is like less of a book and more of a full textbook, considering this was one of my old textbooks from college. But it is a book called With Amusement for All, A History of American Popular Culture Since 1830. Obviously, it's broken up into kind of sections of time, so you don't have to read the whole thing. But something I do remember reading in this book as I was going through the class is the use of pop culture as propaganda, and seeing how we don't really need super crazy government conspiracies because pop culture is the best propaganda. Like, we don't need chemicals in the water turning the frogs gay. Like, pop culture is an incredible propaganda machine, and seeing that through, you know, the mid-1800s with Manifest Destiny and how that cropped up in certain storylines of books and like sports and boxing, and kind of how all that played into like that era of American history, and going into like the early 1900s with the Gilded Age and moralizing wealth and how that played into, again, pop culture and the invention of movies and how that became. So it's just like, it was a very cool experience for me to be able to get that kind of structured learning at such a young age of how we are influenced by pop culture and popular media. And I think a book that also looks into this very, very well compared to another book is 1984 by George Orwell. Love this book. Hate how it is used in pop culture a lot of times because it is touted about by people who I don't think have ever read it. But the thing I really like about how George Orwell uses this book is he does really lean on kind of the more social science, pop culture propaganda side of it versus, and this is where I get ranty, Brave New World, one of my least favorite books, really relies heavily on the technology side and how technology is going to take over the world and kill us all. And the thing about technology is it's nothing without a human there to tell it what to do. Versus pop culture, because it is us, because it is our imaginations, our social construct, it can kind of get a mind of its own and grow into weird, crazy things. So I think having read this before I dipped my toes in 1984 really gave me a good perspective on what George Orwell was really talking about. And like, this is obviously more British focused because he was a British author and this is obviously American, but I think it's kind of the same either way. You get the same kind of vibes. So that is why I think these are an excellent pairing. Obviously 1984 is much smaller than this, so you can just read parts of this and get the general vibe, but I think they work very well together, and my reading experience of 1984 was definitely enhanced by having gotten some insights from this book and my class. And finally, I'm gonna end this off with a very obvious one, but that is Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes, or Divine Might is the next one. I haven't read that one yet, but I imagine it's going to be fairly similar to this. And any feminine focused Greek mythology retelling. So Pandora's Jar is by Natalie Haynes, who is a classicist and comedian and has written several of her own feminine-focused Greek mythology retellings. And so in this book, being a nonfiction, she can really just kind of delve into not all of, but some of the prominent women in Greek mythology and talk about how their stories have been portrayed in the past, what kind of feminist readings have been put upon it since its original writings. And I think she just does a really good job of writing in her own voice and making it kind of fun and funny, and it's just really good. So it covers a ton of different women in Greek mythology: Pandora, Jocasta, Helen, Medusa, the Amazons, Clytemnestra, Eurydice, Phaedra, Medea, Penelope. And a lot of these women have gotten a lot of their own Greek mythology retellings. But this one's definitely more like a wine than a beer, because it is fitting a specific type of book rather than a whole genre of books. But I think this has really enhanced my readings of a lot of new feminist Greek retellings coming out. So I will be reading another one, Divine Might, that focuses on the goddesses rather than mortal women like this one does, but it's a good one. Those were my 5 nonfiction and many other fiction pairings that I came up with. Please comment down below with any of your fiction, nonfiction pairings. I would love to hear about them. I love getting into some nonfiction every now and then. And thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next video.